One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in his bed, he had been changed into a monstrous vermin. He lay on his armor-hard back and saw, as he lifted his head up a little, his brown arched abdomen divided up into rigid bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes.
What's happened to me?
It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table, on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread — Samsa was a traveling salesman — hung the picture which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat there erect, lifting up in the direction of the viewer with a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm had disappeared. Gregor's glance then turned to the window. The dreary weather. The raindrops were falling audibly down the metal window ledge, made him quite melancholy.
Why don't I keep sleeping for a little while longer and forget all this foolishness?
But this was entirely impractical, for he was used to sleeping on his right side, but in his present state he could not get himself into this position. No matter how hard he threw himself onto his right side, he always rolled onto his back again. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so that he wouldn't have to see the wriggling legs, and gave up only when he began to feel a light, dull pain at his side, which he'd never felt before.
Oh God, what a demanding job I've chosen. Day in, day out on the road. The stresses of selling are much greater than the actual work going on at the head office, and, in addition to that, I still have to cope with the problems of traveling, the worries about train connections, irregular bad food, temporary and constantly changing human relationships which never come from the heart. To hell with it all.
He felt a slight itching on the top of his abdomen, slowly pushed himself onto his back closer to the bedpost so that he could lift up his head more easily, found the itchy part, which was entirely covered with small white spots. He did not know what to make of them and wanted to feel the place with a leg, but he had retracted it immediately, for the contact felt like a cold shower all over him. He slid back again into his earlier position.
This getting up early makes a man quite idiotic. A man must have his sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like harem women. For instance, when I come back to the inn during the course of the morning to write up the necessary orders, these gentlemen are just sitting down to breakfast. If I were to try that with my boss, I'd be thrown out on the spot. Still, who knows whether that mightn't be really good for me. If I didn't hold back for my parents' sake, I'd quit ages ago. I would have gone to the boss and told him just what I think from the bottom of my heart. He would have fallen right off his desk. How weird is it to sit up at that desk and talk down to the employee from way up there? What's more, the boss has trouble hearing, so the employee has to step up quite close to him. Anyway, I haven't completely given up that hope yet. Once I've got together the money to pay off my parents' debt to him, that would take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do that for sure. Then I'll make the big break. In any case, right now I have to get up. My train leaves at 5 o'clock.
He looked over at the alarm clock ticking away by the chest of drawers.
Good God.
It was 6:30, and the hands were going quietly on. It was even past the half hour, already nearly 1:45. Could the alarm have failed to ring? One saw from the bed that it was properly set for 4 o'clock. Certainly it had rung. Yes, but was it possible to sleep peacefully through that noise which made the furniture shake? Now, it is true he had not slept peacefully, but evidently he had slept all the more deeply. Still, what should he do now? The next train left at 7 o'clock. To catch that one, he would have to go in a mad rush. The sample collection was not packed up yet, and he really did not feel particularly fresh and active. And even if he got the train, there was no avoiding a blow-up with the boss, because the firm's errand boy would have waited for the 5 o'clock train and reported the news of his absence long ago. He was the boss's minion, without backbone and intelligence. Well then, what if he reported in sick? That would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious, because during his 5 years' service, Gregor had not been sick even once. The boss would certainly come with the doctor from the health insurance company and would reproach his parents for their lazy son and cut short all objections with the insurance doctor's comments. For him, everybody was completely healthy but really lazy about work. And besides, would the doctor in this case be totally wrong? Apart from really excessive drowsiness after a long sleep, Gregor, in fact, felt quite well and even had a really strong appetite. As he was thinking all this over in the greatest haste, without being able to make a decision to get out of bed, the alarm clock was indicating exactly 7:15. There was a cautious knock at the door by the head of the bed.
Gregor, it's 7:15. Don't you want to be on your way?
Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm getting up right away.
Gregor was startled when he heard his voice answering. It was clearly and unmistakably his earlier voice, but in it was intermingled, as if From below, an irrepressible, painful squeaking, which left the words positively distinct only in the first moment and distorted them in the reverberation, so that one did not know if one had heard correctly. Because of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was not really noticeable outside, so his mother calmed down with this explanation and shuffled off. However, as a result of the short conversation, the other family members became aware that Gregor was unexpectedly still at home, and already his father was knocking on one side door.
Gregor? Gregor, what's going on? Gregor? Gregor?
At the other side door, Gregor's sister knocked lightly.
Gregor, are you all right? Do you need anything?
I'll be ready right away.
Gregor, open the door. I beg you.
Gregor had no intention of opening the door, but congratulated himself on his precaution, acquired from traveling, of locking all doors during the night, even at home. First, he wanted to stand up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed, and above all, have breakfast, and only then consider further action. For he noticed this clearly. By thinking things over in bed, he would not reach a reasonable conclusion. He remembered that he had already often felt some light pain or other in bed, perhaps the result of an awkward lying position, which later, once he stood up, turned out to be purely imaginary, and he was eager to see how his present fantasies would gradually dissipate, that the change in his voice was nothing other than the onset of a real chill, an occupational illness of commercial travelers. Of that he had not the slightest doubt. It was very easy to throw aside the blanket. He needed only to push himself up a little and it fell by itself. But to continue was difficult, particularly because he felt so unusually wide. He needed arms and hands to push himself upright. Instead of these, however, he had only many small limbs, which were incessantly moving from very different motions, and which, in addition, he was unable to control. If he wanted to bend one of them, then it was the first to extend itself, and if he finally succeeded doing what he wanted with his limb, in the meantime, all the others, as if left free, moved around in an excessively painful agitation.
But I must not stay in bed uselessly.
At first, he wanted to get out of bed with the lower part of his body, but this lower part, which, by the way, he had not yet looked at, and which he could not picture clearly, proved itself too difficult to move. The attempt went so slowly. When, having become almost frantic, he finally hurled himself forward with all of his force and without thinking. He chose his direction incorrectly and he hit the lower bedpost hard. The violent pain he felt revealed to him that the lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. Thus, he tried to get his upper body out of the bed first and turned his head carefully toward the edge of the bed. He managed to do this easily, and in spite of its width and weight, his body mass at last slowly followed the turning of his head. But as he finally raised his head outside the bed in the open air, he became anxious about moving forward any further in this manner. For if he allowed himself eventually to fall by this process, it would really take a miracle to prevent his head from being injured. And at all costs, he must not lose consciousness right now. He preferred to stay in bed. However, after similar effort, while he lay there again, sighing as before, and once again saw his small limbs fighting one another, if anything even worse than earlier, and did not see any chance of imposing quiet and order on this arbitrary movement, he told himself that he could not possibly remain in bed, and that it might be the most reasonable thing to sacrifice everything if there was even the slightest hope of getting himself out of bed in the process. At the same moment, however, he did not forget to remind himself from time to time of the fact that calm, indeed the calmest, reflection might be much better than confused decisions. At such moments, he directed his gaze as precisely as he could towards the window, but unfortunately there was little confident cheer to be had from a glance at the morning mist, which concealed even the other side of the narrow street.
It's already 7 o'clock. Already 7 o'clock and still such a fog?
For a little while longer, he lay quietly with weak breathing, as if perhaps waiting for normal and natural conditions to reemerge out of the complete stillness.
Before it strikes 7:15, whatever happens, I must be completely out of bed. Besides, by then someone from the office will arrive to inquire about me, because the office will open before 7 o'clock.
And he made an effort then to rock his entire body length out of the bed with a uniform motion. If he let himself fall out of the bed in this way, his head, which in the course of the fall he intended to lift up sharply, would probably remain uninjured. His back seemed to be hard. Nothing would really happen to that as a result of the fallen carpet. His greatest reservation was a worry about the loud noise which the fall must create and which presumably would arouse, if not fright, then at least concern on the other side of all of the doors. However, he had to take that chance. As Gregor was already in the process of lifting himself half out of the bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. He needed only to rock with a series of jerks. It struck him how easy all of this would be if someone were to come to his aid. 2 strong people. He thought about his father and the servant girl. That would be quite sufficient. They would only have to push their arms under his arched back to get him up out of bed, to bend down with their load, and then merely to exercise patience so that he could complete the flip on the floor, where his diminutive legs would then, he hoped, acquire a purpose. Now, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really call out for help? In spite of all his distress, he was unable to suppress a smile at the idea. He had already got to the point where, by rocking more strongly, he maintained his equilibrium with difficulty, and very soon he would finally have to make a final decision, for in 5 minutes it would be 7:15. Then there was a ring at the door of the apartment.
That's someone from the office.
For one moment, everything remained still.
They aren't opening.
But of course then, as usual, the servant girl with her firm tread went to the door and opened it.
Good morning.
Gregor needed to hear only the first word of the visitor's greeting to recognize immediately who it was, the manager himself. Why was Gregor the only one condemned to work in a firm where, at the slightest lapse, someone at once attracted the greatest suspicion? Were all the employees then collectively one and all scoundrels? Among them, was there then no truly devoted person who, if he failed to use just a couple of hours in the morning for office work, would become abnormal with pangs of conscience and really be in no state to get out of bed? Was it really not enough to let an apprentice make inquiries, if such questioning was even generally necessary? Must the manager himself come, and in the process, must it be demonstrated to the entire innocent family that the investigation of this suspicious circumstance could be entrusted only to the intelligence of the manager? And more as a consequence of the excited state in which this idea put Gregor than as a result of an actual decision, he swung himself with all of his might out of the bed. There was a loud thud, but not a real crash. The fall was absorbed somewhat by the carpet, and in addition, his back was more elastic than Gregor had thought. For that reason, the dull noise was not quite so conspicuous. But he had not held his head up with sufficient care, and he had hit it. He turned his head, irritated and in pain, and rubbed it on the carpet.
Something has fallen in there.
Gregor tried to imagine himself whether anything similar to what was happening to him today could also have happened at some point to the manager. At least one had to concede the possibility of such a thing. However, as if to give a rough answer to this question, the manager now, with the squeak of his polished boots, took a few determined steps in the next room.
Gregor, manager is here.
I know.
Gregor, Mr. Manager has come and is asking why you have not left on the early train. We don't know what we should tell him. Besides, he also wants to speak to you personally, so please open the door. He will be good enough to forgive the mess in your room.
Good morning, Mr. Samsa.
He's not well. He is not well. Believe me, Mr. Manager. Otherwise, how would Gregor miss a train? The young man has nothing in his head except business. I'm almost angry that he never goes out in the evening. Right now, he's been in the city 8 days, but he's been at home every evening. He sits here with us at the table and reads the newspaper quietly or studies his travel schedules. It's quite a diversion for him to busy himself with fretwork. For instance, he cut out a small frame over the course of 2 or 3 evenings. You'd be amazed how pretty it is. It's hanging right inside the room. You'll see it immediately as soon as Gregor opens the door. Anyway, I'm happy that you're here, Mr. Manager. By ourselves, we would never have made Gregor open the door. He's so stubborn, and he's certainly not well, although he denied that this morning.
I'm coming right away.
My dear lady, I cannot explain it to myself in any other way. I hope it is nothing serious. On the other hand, I might also say that we business people, luckily or unluckily, however one looks at it, very often simply have to overcome a slight indisposition for business reasons.
So can Mr. Manager come in to see you now?
No.
In the neighboring room on the left, an awkward stillness descended. In the neighboring room on the right, the sister began to sob. Why did his sister not go to the others? She'd probably just got up out of bed now and had not even started to get dressed yet. Then why was she crying? Because he was not getting up and letting the manager in, because he was in danger of losing his position, and because then his boss would badger his parents once again with the old demands. Those were probably unnecessary worries right now. Gregor was still here and not thinking at all about abandoning his family. At the moment, he was lying right there on the carpet, and no one who knew about his condition would have seriously demanded that he let the manager in. But Gregor would not casually be dismissed right away because of this small discourtesy, for which he would find an easy and suitable excuse later on. It seemed to Gregor that it might be far more reasonable to leave him in peace at the moment, instead of disturbing him with crying and conversation. But it was the very uncertainty which distressed the others and excused their behavior.
Mr. Samsa, what's the matter? You are barricading yourself there in your room, answering with only a yes and a no. You are making a serious and unnecessary trouble for your parents, and neglecting, I mention this only incidentally, your commercial duties in a truly unheard of manner. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and your employer, and I am requesting you in all seriousness for an immediate and clear explanation. I am amazed. I thought I knew you as a calm, reasonable person, and now you appear suddenly to want to start parading around in weird moods. The chief indicated to me earlier this very day a possible explanation for your neglect. It concerns the collection of cash entrusted to you a short while ago. But in truth, I almost gave him my word of honor that this explanation cannot be correct. However, now I see here your unimaginable pig-headedness, and I'm totally losing any desire to speak up for you in the slightest. And your position is not at all the most secure. Originally, I intended to mention all of this to you privately, but since you are letting me waste my time here uselessly, I don't know why the matter shouldn't come to the attention of your parents as well. Your productivity has also been very unsatisfactory recently. Of course, it's not the time of year to conduct exceptional business. We recognize that. But a time of year for conducting no business? There is no such thing at all, Mr. Samsa, and such a thing must not be permitted.
But, Mr. Manager, I'm opening the door immediately. This very moment. A slight indisposition, a dizzy spell, has prevented me from getting up. I'm still laying in bed right now, but I'm quite refreshed once again. I'm in the midst of getting out of bed. Just have patience for a short moment. Things are not yet going as well as I thought, but things are all right with me.
While Gregor was quickly blurting all this out, hardly aware of what he was saying, he had moved close to the chest of drawers without effort, probably as a result of the practice he had already had in bed, and now he was trying to raise himself up on it. Actually, he wanted to open the door. He really wanted to let himself be seen and to speak with the manager. He was keen to witness what the others now asking about him would say when they saw him. If they were startled, then Gregor had no more responsibility and could be calm. But if they accepted everything quietly, then he would have no reason to get excited, and if he got to move on, could really be at the station around 8 o'clock.
How suddenly can this overcome someone? Only yesterday evening everything was fine with me. My parents certainly know that. Actually, just yesterday evening I had a small premonition. People must have seen that in me. Why have I not reported that to the office? But people always think that they'll get over sickness without having to stay home.
At first, he slid down a few times on the smooth chest of drawers, but at last he gave himself a final swing and stood upright there. He was no longer at all aware of the pains in his lower body, no matter how they might still sting. Now he let himself fall against the back of the nearby chair, on the edge of which he braced himself with his small limbs.
Mr. Manager, take it easy on my parents. There is really no basis for the criticisms which you're now making against me. Nobody has said a word to me about that. Perhaps you have not read the latest orders which I sent in. Besides, now I'm setting out on my trip on the 8 o'clock train. The few hours rest have made me stronger. Mr. Manager, do not stay. I will be at the office in person right away. Please have the goodness to say that and to convey my respects to the chief.
Do you understand even a single word? Is he playing the fool with us?
For God's sake! Perhaps he's very ill and we're upsetting him! Greta! Greta!
Mother!
You must go to the doctors right away. Gregor is sick. Hurry to the doctor. Did you hear Gregor speak just now? That was an animal's voice.
Anna! Fetch a locksmith right away!
The two young women were already running through the hall with swishing skirts. How had his sister dressed herself so quickly and pulled open the doors of the apartment? One could not hear the doors closing at all. They probably had left them open, as is customary in an apartment where a huge misfortune had taken place. However, Gregor had become much calmer. All right, people didn't understand his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him. Clearer than previously, and perhaps his ears had gotten used to them. But at least people now thought that things were not completely all right with him and was prepared to help him. The confidence and assurance with which the first arrangements had been carried out made him feel good. He felt himself included once again in the circle of humanity and was expecting from both the doctor and the locksmith, without differentiating between them with any real precision, splendid and surprising results. In order to get as clear a voice as possible for the critical conversation which was imminent, he coughed a little, and certainly took the trouble to do this in a really subdued way, since it was possible that even the noise sounded like something different from a human cough. He no longer trusted himself to decide anymore. Meanwhile, in the next room, it had become really quiet. Perhaps his parents were sitting with the manager at the table whispering. Perhaps they were all leaning against the door listening. Gregor pushed himself slowly towards the door with the help of the easy chair, let go of it there, threw himself against the door, and held himself upright against it. The balls of his tiny limbs had little sticky stuff on them, and he rested there momentarily from his exertion. Then he made an effort to turn the key in the lock with his mouth. Unfortunately, it seemed that he had no real teeth. How then was he able to grab a hold of the key? But to make up for that, his jaws were naturally very strong. With their help, he managed to get the key really moving. He did not notice that he was obviously inflicting some damage on himself, for a brown fluid came out of his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped onto the floor.
Just listen! He's turning the key!
For Gregor, that was a great encouragement, but they should all have called out to him, including his father and mother. Imagining that all of his efforts were being followed with suspense, he bit down frantically on the key with all the force he could muster. As the key turned more, he danced around the lock. Now he was holding himself upright only with his mouth, and he had to hang onto the key or then press it down again with the whole weight of his body as necessary. The quite distinct click of the lock as it finally snapped really woke Gregor up.
So, I didn't need the locksmith.
He set his head against the door handle to open the door completely. Because he had to open the door in this way, it was already open really wide without him yet being visible. He first had to turn himself slowly around the edge of the door, very carefully, of course, if he did not want to fall awkwardly on his back at the entrance into the room. He was still preoccupied with this difficult movement and had no time to pay attention to anything else.
Oh!
It sounded like the wind whistling, and now he saw him, nearest to the door, pressing his hand against his open mouth and moving slowly back, as if an invisible, constant force was pushing him away. His mother, in spite of the presence of the manager, she was standing here with her hair sticking up on end, still a mess from the night, first looked at his father with her hands clasped, then went 2 steps towards Gregor and collapsed right in the middle of her skirts, which were spread out all around her. Her face sunk on her breast, completely concealed. His father clenched his fist with a hostile expression, as if he wished to push Gregor back into his room, and then looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and cried so that his mighty breast shook. At this point, Gregor did not want to take one step into the room, but leaned his body from the inside against the firmly bolted wing of the door, so that only half of his body was visible, as well as his head, tilted sideways, with which he peered over at the others. Meanwhile, it had become much brighter. Standing out clearly from the other side of the street was a section of the endless gray-black house situated opposite, It was a hospital, with its severe, regular windows breaking up the facade. The rain was still coming down, but only in large individual drops, visibly and firmly thrown down one by one onto the ground. Countless breakfast dishes were standing piled around on the table because for his father, breakfast was the most important mealtime in the day, which he prolonged for hours by reading various newspapers. Directly on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from the time of his military service. It was a picture of him as a lieutenant, as he, smiling and worry-free, with his hand on his sword, demanded respect for his bearing and uniform. The door to the wall was ajar, and since the door to the apartment was also open, one could see out onto the landing of the apartment and the start of the staircase going down.
Now, I'll get dressed right away, pack up the collection of samples, and set off. You'll allow me to set out on my way, will you not? You see, Mr. Manager, I'm not pig-headed, and I'm happy to work. Traveling is exhausting, but I couldn't live without it.
At Gregor's first words, the manager had already turned away, and now he looked back with pursed lips at Gregor over his twitching shoulders.
Where are you going, Mr. Manager? To the office? Really? Will you report everything truthfully? A person can be incapable of work momentarily, but that's precisely the best time to remember the earlier achievements and to consider that later, after the obstacles have been shoved aside. The person will certainly work all the more diligently and intensely. I'm really so indebted to Mr. Chief. You know that perfectly well. On the other hand, I'm concerned about my parents and my sister. I'm in a fix, but I'll work myself out of it again. Don't make things more difficult for me than they already are. Speak up on my behalf in the office. People don't like traveling salesmen. I know that. People think they earn tons of money and thus lead a fine life. People don't even have any special reason to think through this judgment more clearly. But you, Mr. Manager, have a better perspective of what's involved than other people. Even, I tell you in total confidence, a better perspective than Mr. Chief himself, who in his capacity as the employer may easily let his judgment make mistakes at the expense of an employee. You also know well enough that the traveling salesman who is outside the office almost the entire year can become so easily a victim of gossip, coincidences, and groundless complaints, against which it's totally impossible for him to defend himself, since for the most part he doesn't hear about them at all until only then when he's exhausted after finishing a trip and at home gets to feel his own body the nasty consequences, which can't be thoroughly explored back to their origin.
During Gregor's speech, he was not still for a moment, but kept moving away towards the door, without taking his eyes off Gregor, but really, gradually, as if there was a secret ban on leaving the room. He was already in the hall, and given the sudden movement with which he finally pulled his foot out of the living room, one could have believed that he had just burned the sole of his foot. In the hall, however, he stretched out his right hand, out away from his body towards the staircase, as if some truly supernatural relief was waiting for him there.
Mr. Manager, don't leave without speaking a word indicating to me that you'll at least concede that I'm a little in the right. Hey! Mr. Manager, come back! Hey!
Gregor realized that he must not, under any circumstances, allow the manager to go away in this frame of mind, especially if his position in the firm was not to be placed in the greatest danger. His parents did not understand all of this very well. Over the years, they had developed the conviction that Gregor was set up for life in this firm, and, in addition, they had so much to do nowadays with their present troubles that all foresight was foreign to them. But Gregor had this foresight. The manager must have held back, calmed down, convinced, and finally won over. The future of Gregor and his family really depended on it. If only the sister had been there. She was clever. She had already cried while Gregor was still lying quietly on his back, and the manager, this friend of the ladies, would certainly let himself be guided by her. She would have closed the door to the apartment and talked him out of his fright in the hall. But the sister was not even there. Gregor must deal with it himself. And without that, his speech possibly, indeed probably, had once again not been understood. He left the wing of the door, pushed himself through the opening, and wanted to go over to the manager, who was already holding tight with both hands, gripping on the handrail of the landing in a ridiculous way. But as Gregor looked for something to steady himself, with a small scream, he immediately fell down into his numerous little legs. Scarcely had this happened when he felt for the first time that morning a general physical well-being. The small limbs had firm floor underneath them. They obeyed perfectly, as he noticed to his joy, and even strove to carry him forward in the direction that he wanted. Right away, he believed that the final amelioration of all of his suffering was immediately at hand. But at that very moment, when he lay on the floor rocking in a constrained manner quite close and directly across from his mother, who had apparently totally sunk into herself, she suddenly sprang right up with her arms spread far apart and her fingers extended and cried out,
Help! For God's sake, help! 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 Help him! Help my boy! Help him!
She held her head bowed down, as if she wanted to view Gregor better, but ran senselessly back, contradicting that gesture, forgetting that behind her stood the table with all the dishes on it. When she reached the table, she sat down heavily on it, as if absent-mindedly, and did not appear to notice at all that next to her coffee was pouring into the carpet in a full stream from the large, overturned container.
Mother? Mother?
The manager had momentarily vanished completely from his mind. On the other hand, when he saw the flowing coffee, Gregor could not stop himself, snapping his jaws in the air a few times. At that, his mother screamed all over again and hurried from the table and collapsed into the arms of his father, who was rushing towards her. But Gregor had no time right now for his parents. The manager was already on the staircase. With his chin on the banister, the manager looked back for the last time. Gregor took the initial movement to catch up to him if possible, but the manager must have suspected something because he made a leap down over the stairs and disappeared, still shouting.
Hey! Mr. Manager!
But now, unfortunately, this flight of the manager seemed to bewilder his father completely. Earlier, he had been relatively calm, for instead of running after the manager himself, or at least not hindering Gregor from his pursuit, with his right hand he grabbed a hold of the manager's cane, which he had left behind on a chair with his hat and overcoat. With his left hand, his father grabbed a large newspaper from the table, and stamping his feet on the floor, he set out to drive Gregor back into his room by waving the cane and the newspaper. No request of Gregor's was of any use. No request would even be understood. No matter how willing he was to turn his head respectfully, his father just stomped all the harder with his feet. Across the room from him, his mother had pulled open a window, in spite of the cool weather, and leaning out with her hands on her cheeks, she pushed her face far outside the window. Between the lane and the stairwell, a strong draft came up. The curtains on the window flew around, and newspapers on the table rustled, and individual sheets fluttered down over the floor. The father relentlessly pushed his way forward, hissing like a wild man. Now Gregor still had no practice at all in going backwards. It was really very slow going. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn himself around, he might have been in his room right away. But he was afraid to make his father impatient by the time-consuming process of turning around, and each moment he faced the threat of a mortal blow on his back or his head from the cane in his father's hand. Finally, Gregor had no other option, for he noticed with horror that he did not understand yet how to maintain his direction going backwards. And so he began, amid constantly anxious sideways glances in his father's direction, to turn himself around as quickly as possible, although in truth this was only done very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his good intentions, for he did not disrupt Gregor in this motion. If only his father had not hissed so unbearably. Because of that, Gregor totally lost his head. He was already almost totally turned around when, always with this hissing in his ear, he just made a mistake and turned himself back a little.
No!
But when he finally was successful in getting his head in front of the door opening, it became clear that his body was too wide to go any further. Naturally, his father, in his present mental state, had no idea of, say, opening the other wing of the door a bit to create a suitable passage for Gregor to get through. His single fixed thought was that Gregor must get into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have allowed the elaborate preparations that Gregor required to orient himself, and thus perhaps in this way to get through the door. Perhaps with his excessive noise, he was now driving Gregor forwards as if there were no obstacle. Behind Gregor, the sound at this point was no longer like the voice of only a single father. Now it was really no longer a joke, and Gregor forced himself, come what might, into the door. One side of his body was lifted up. He lay at an angle in the door opening. His one flank was really sore from the scraping. On the white door, ugly blotches were left. Soon, he was stuck fast, and he would not have been able to move any more on his own. The tiny legs on one side hung twitching in the air above, and the ones on the other side were pushed painfully into the floor. Then his father gave him one really strong, liberating push from behind, and he scurried, bleeding severely, far into the interior of his room. The door was slammed shut with a cane, and then finally it was quiet.